All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our Sunday school class on critical race theory and anti-racism. This is now the 10th lesson in our series, and today we're going to be focusing on the topic of discrimination and disparities. I do want to do just a little bit of review on some of the material that we've discussed in our previous lessons because it's going to help set up our discussion today. You might remember how I contrasted two different visions of racial justice. There's what's called the colorblind vision, and then there's the anti-racist vision of racial justice. Now, the colorblind vision of racial justice I described as process-based. That is, it's concerned about the legal procedures and the standards within a society to ensure that everybody is held according to the same standards, treated according to the same rules. So due process, rule of law, these principles of our constitutional order are emphasized within the colorblind vision of racial justice. It's individualistic in the sense that it treats people as an individual according to their own character, their own merits, and so we can call that meritocratic. And this would be the vision of classical liberalism, the idea that every person is treated equally, held according to the same standard, and that those who work hardest would succeed. And sort of that principle of, we can call that the American dream, the notion of America as the land of opportunity. That's all kind of enshrined in this colorblind vision of racial justice. Contrast that with what we've been focusing on in this class, which is CRT in the technical sense, or more broadly, it's called anti-racism, which is more outcome-based. It's concerned with our groups achieving the same level of wealth or home ownership rates. Do they have roughly the same incarceration rates, education levels? And it's looking at all of these various metrics and saying, is society equal between different groups in all of these different measures? That's the criteria for justice on this vision. So it's very much oriented around identity politics, treating people as not just as individuals, but as members of particular identity groups, whether that's in terms of race or gender or sexuality or whatever. And so, to create this kind of society, they focus on redistribution of resources. And so it's a more top-down vision of how justice is attained. And so that would fit in line with a more progressive view of society. So these are kind of the two contrasting visions of racial justice. Keep these in mind because we're going to come back to them as we analyze various disparities in America today. You may recall from about a month or so ago, we did an entire lesson on this topic of systemic racism. And you might recall how I said that systemic racism is one of the three key elements in my working definition of critical race theory. So that would have been, those three elements would have been systemic racism, structural determinism, and standpoint epistemology. Generally speaking, if you add those together, that is what people mean by CRT. And so, in any critical theory, you may recall how we talked about the Frankfurt School and names like Herbert Marcuse. They were the ones who developed the notion of critical theory in the mid-20th century. And according to their definition of a critical theory, what makes a theory critical is these three elements. It has to be normative, explanatory, and practical. You apply those three concepts to the notion of racism or systemic racism, and this is how you would define systemic racism in a critical theory. Those disparities are ipso facto unjust. And according to a critical theory, the explanation for that is the fact that these disparities are caused by structures of racial oppression. And so what do we do about that? So a critical theory is also practical, and that means we must take action to dismantle or disrupt those structures causing racial disparities. To put it more simply, one of the leading anti-racist advocates today is Ibram X. Kendi. He wrote the book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this is a famous quote that he said. He says, "When I see racial disparities, I see racism." So he's very clear and straightforward in his analysis of racial disparities in America today. He says that if you see a racial disparity, that in itself is proof of racial discrimination in America. And so that's the claim that I want us to unpack today. What is the relationship between racial disparities and racial discrimination? Now, as I said, one of the books that I used in preparation for this lesson was the book Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth by Thaddeus Williams, and he gives several examples of alleged discrimination. Look at some of these examples. In California's Silicon Valley, women make up a mere 15.67% of tech jobs, like programmers and engineers, at tech giants Apple, Google, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Yahoo. On the New Jersey Turnpike, black drivers receive nearly twice as many speeding tickets as white drivers. Third, mortgage lenders rejected twice as many blacks as whites for home loans, 44.6% compared to 22.3%, according to data from a 2000 U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report. So, what do you think? Are these inequalities automatically evidence of oppression, whether sexism or racism? Well, let's unpack these and find out what's actually going on here. Here is a relevant quote by Thomas Sowell in his book, and the name of my lesson was stolen from this book. The book is called Discrimination and Disparities. And here's a relevant quote where he is arguing that a lot of the inequalities that we see in America are the result of morally neutral demographic factors, such as age or geography. So here's what he says. In the United States, income differences between middle-aged people and young adults are larger than income differences between blacks and whites. Ethnic and other social groups differ in median ages by as much as 2 decades or more. In the United States, for example, the median age of Japanese Americans is 51, and the median age of Mexican Americans is 27. How likely is it that these two groups, or others, would have the same proportions of their populations equally represented in occupations, institutions, or activities requiring long years of education and or long years of job experience? Is it surprising if Hispanic Americans are not as well represented as Japanese Americans in the professions or in managerial careers for which long years of education and experience are usually required? How many 27-year-olds of any ethnic background meet the requirements for being CEOs in civilian life or generals and admirals in the You see what's going on here? You are, even in a society completely absent any kind of racial or ethnic discrimination, given differences in median age, you're going to have disparities in income, for example. Given this fact alone, the median age for Japanese Americans is 51 and for Mexican Americans is 27, you would expect vastly different median incomes, wouldn't you? I mean, speaking from personal experience, I can say I'm earning more now than I did when I was 27, right? And I'm sure that's true for most of you, right? That's just the reality of the correlation between age and income. And so we would expect to find disparities like this as a result of morally neutral categories like age, and there are other categories that we could look at as well. So, to go back to the example of the New Jersey Turnpike, yes, it is true that black drivers received more speeding tickets than white drivers. But did you also know that the median age differs between blacks and whites by about 10 years? And who's more likely to speed? Younger drivers or older drivers? Younger drivers, right? So a lot of that disparity is explained simply on account of age. So what's actually going on here? Let me explain it to you in very, well, not so simple terms. I'm going to add a couple new terms to your vocabulary today. There's a difference between univariate analysis and multivariate analysis. Has anybody heard these terms before? Okay, some of you have. Let me explain what these mean. A univariate analysis is when you're doing a statistical analysis measuring only one variable, for example, race. A multivariate analysis is when you're doing a statistical analysis taking into account multiple variables. So, like when Ibram Kendi said that when I see racial disparities, I see racism, he's taking into account one variable. He's looking at race. But he's not looking at how other variables might be relevant in explaining those disparities. So what I want to do is give you guys a couple examples here. And you may recall these examples from my lesson on systemic racism from a few weeks ago. Look at the disparity between bachelor's degrees. Okay, so among both whites and blacks, the rate of bachelor's degree attainment has increased over the years. So from 1964 to 2020, for blacks, it has gone up from 4% to 28%. For whites, it's gone up from 10% to 41%. Notice that means the gap is slightly widening, even though it's increasing for both groups. But that means we now have a gap of about 13 percentage points between whites and blacks. Kendi and folks like him would look at that and say, that's racism. But I want to show you what happens when we do a multivariate analysis on this. This is an infographic that I found on Twitter. It comes from the Wall Street Journal, but this was just recently released on, well, this actually goes, I think it was released in 2019, or it's based on data from October 2019. But I know this is a little bit harder to read, but look at what we have being described here. We're looking at college enrollment rates as a measure not only of race, but also of gender and income levels. And when you look at college enrollment rates as a function of race, gender, and income level, what happens? This might be a little bit hard for you to see from where you're sitting, so I'm going to try and make it easier on you. Look at the differences between white men's college enrollment rates and black men's college enrollment rates. In each income level, what happens? The college enrollment rate is actually lower for white men in each income level compared to black men. Now, in general, now compare white women and black women. It's a little bit more mixed. At the lowest and highest income levels, white women are enrolled at higher rates, but in the middle two income levels, black women are enrolled at higher rates. But overall, women are enrolled in college at higher rates than men, with one interesting exception here, which is black men in the highest income level. See how all of that would be missed if you're just doing a univariate analysis here? And that's going to be significant if you're wanting to know what is actually causing these disparities. If you're only looking at one variable, a lot of questions are going to go unanswered. And so that's why it's important for us to be careful in the way we use statistics. Statistics can be abused in all kinds of ways. There's an entire book that was written called How to Lie with Statistics. This is why it's important for us to recognize the importance of using statistics carefully, because they can be misused to draw conclusions that are not warranted. Let me give you guys another example here, jumping ahead. Let's look at the gap in home ownership. This is a pretty substantial gap, and it always has been. So currently, the white home ownership rate is around 75%, and the black home ownership rate is around 46%. So that is a gap of about 29 percentage points. Now, if that's the only variable you're looking at, you might think, okay, that's racism. However, I actually looked at a report released by the Urban Institute, which is a liberal independent think tank, and they actually analyzed the homeownership gap according to multiple variables, and here's what they found. The largest factor in accounting for the gap in home ownership rates is income differences between blacks and whites. So in other words, if you are comparing home ownership rates between blacks and whites in the same income bracket, that closes the gap between them by 9.3 percentage points. That's about a third of the gap between them is closed just by looking at income. Another significant portion of that gap is closed by considering marital status, because the reality is that single people are less likely to own homes than married people. And the marriage rate among black Americans is much lower than the marriage rate among white Americans. And another significant factor is credit score. So if you have a higher credit score, you are more likely to be approved for a home mortgage and therefore to become a homeowner. But there is a gap in credit scores between black Americans and white Americans as well. So when you are comparing black Americans and white Americans in the same income level, with the same marital status, with roughly the same credit score, that closes that home ownership gap to about 5 percentage points. Now that's not nothing. There's still a difference there, and that difference is unaccounted for at this point. That could be a consequence of racial discrimination. It could also be a variety of other factors. They speculated in the study that it could be help through parental wealth. It could be through financial education. It could be a function of geography. There are all sorts of other factors that might be the explanation behind that 5 percentage point gap. And we can admit, I think, that racism could be a factor in that as well. Racial discrimination could be a factor in that as well. But notice, that's not the primary factor here. And so if we want to know what's actually causing these gaps, we have to do more than just a simplistic univariate analysis. We actually have to dig into all of these other differences as well. In addition to that, there's also the reality that there are all sorts of other factors that can produce disparities that have nothing to do with injustice. So for example, Thaddeus Williams lists several surprising disparities in our society. So for example, 22 of the 29 astronauts from the original Apollo space program were firstborns. People living in the US experience 90% of the world's tornadoes. Asians are underrepresented in the NBA, the NFL, the NHL, and the MLB. Women are overrepresented in healthcare and in attaining university degrees. Men make up an overwhelming majority of soldiers who perish on battlefields and have a virtual monopoly of the bricklaying, plumbing, and carpentry industries. Jewish people are less than 1% of the world population, but have received 22% of Nobel Prizes in chemistry, 32% in medicine, and 32% in physics. All kinds of unequal outcomes in society, right? And yet, would anybody say that these are caused by oppression? That does not seem likely, right? There are morally neutral factors that have nothing to do with injustice or oppression in society that can account for these inequalities. So if your standard of justice is equal outcomes, you're going to have a hard time explaining things like this. And you're going to have an even harder time of producing a society where those outcomes actually are equalized. Here's another relevant quote that Williams has to make, because a lot of these inequalities in society are simply the consequence of different choices that people make in different groups. Different people with different priorities making different choices will experience different outcomes. If we believe that different outcomes are a priori evidence of injustice, then freedom itself is unjust. Moreover, any systems that seek to maximize freedoms, such as free markets, must be abolished as systemic injustice. Different outcomes are the price of freedom. The converse is also true. Tyranny is the price of equal outcomes. All that to say that when we see a racial disparity in America, we cannot automatically assume that it's a direct consequence of racism. But on the other hand, the other truth is that we can't automatically assume that racism is not present either. There are racial disparities in America that do have some connection to our history of racial discrimination. And this, I think, is where George Yancey's book is particularly helpful. He has an entire chapter where he's trying to show examples of institutional discrimination in America. Now, one thing that I appreciated about his book is he was careful to avoid the term systemic racism. He recognizes that term has become very loaded, and it's used in very simplistic ways, especially by anti-racist activists like Kendi or D'Angelo. And so he's going to use the more nuanced term, institutional discrimination. And I'm going to summarize that chapter for you. Again, this book was just released, so I just finished reading this chapter like yesterday. So I'm still processing it, but I'm going to share with you some of my reflections on this chapter. But here's his argument. He wants us to take seriously the ongoing effects of residential segregation. So he's looking at those who have grown up in segregated neighborhoods and the difficulties, the barriers that they are facing. And so he sees examples of lower mortgage approval rates. He sees lack of access to resources. Now, resources in a variety of ways. That could be transportation infrastructure. That could be quality education. That could be grocery stores in your neighborhood. That could be jobs that are available in your neighborhood. Now, just to make this a little bit more local and concrete for us, so within the Memphis area, we do have a history of residential racial segregation, right? That should not be a surprise to you. So if you contrast the demographics of our neighborhood, here in Germantown, with like a community like Orange Mound, you're going to see very different demographics, right? So here in Germantown, I think the percentage of African American residents is about 2%, very small. Now, it's almost the opposite in Orange Mound, where it's only about 2% white. So the vast majority of the residents in Orange Mound are African American, and here in Germantown, they're white. That was largely, not exclusively, but largely a consequence of redlining policies. Now, do you remember what redlining is? We talked about this, I think it was just last week in our discussion on American history. So redlining was the policy that banks did in the mid-20th century where they would designate certain neighborhoods as risky investments, and they would mark them off on a map with a big red line and say, do not invest here. Now, banks still do redlining, but not on race-based criteria. They use criteria like crime and poverty levels to determine what is the riskiness, the risk level of investing in that particular neighborhood. So it still happens, it's just no longer on the basis of race. But it used to be on the basis of race. And as a consequence of redlining, what happened is African Americans were, for a significant period of time, denied access to home mortgages, and that drove down home values, that prevented businesses from investing in those neighborhoods, which drove down the employment rate because there were fewer jobs available in those neighborhoods. There were all kinds of harmful effects from redlining. And so that practice was put an end to in the 1960s through legislation like the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But some of the effects of that residential segregation is still ongoing. And I don't think anybody would deny that we do still see the ongoing effects of racist policies from the past. So there is still a lack of access to resources, say, in Orange Mound compared to Germantown, for example. There is also, because of residential segregation, a higher concentration of dysfunctional elements in lower class communities of color. So that is, there's higher crime rates. There are going to be a higher percentage of disruptive students in the classroom. And these other factors, which then have a ripple effect in other factors in the community. So for example, if there's a higher crime rate, there's going to be more police involvement in the neighborhood, right? Which increases the likelihood of your encounter with police. And some of those encounters might not go so great, right? And so that's going to be another factor. And like I said, fewer businesses are going to move into that neighborhood. And even those that do might have to raise the prices, not because they're being greedy, but because they have to cover the cost that results from shoplifting and robbery and factors like that. And so just the prices of goods tend to go up in poorer neighborhoods, even though the profits for those same businesses tend to be lower. That's just the reality of doing business in poorer neighborhoods. We can trace all of that back to racist policies like redlining. Further, he looks at the category of institutional discrimination in disparities in the criminal justice system. I'm going to save our discussion on that for 2 weeks from now because I'm going to do an entire lesson on the criminal justice system. Here's another reality that he points to. Often, hiring happens simply through social networks. It happens by word of mouth. So if you are a business owner and you are looking to hire an employee, you're more likely to reach out to your friends to find out, hey, do you have a kid or something that's looking for a job? Because I need somebody to do this job for me. And we do that, understandably, because knowing people personally is a good filter for determining who has the qualifications we want or need in hiring. But here's the problem. When we live in a racially segregated society, and we still experience the effects of segregation, even though we don't have segregation by policy anymore, but because of that, the social networks that we live in are going to be generally limited to our race. So if we're doing hiring by word of mouth, you may not have any racist intent, but that does mean that you are more likely to hire within your racial group. And he mentions transportation systems and other forms of discrimination. And then he looks at the category of racial bias. And so, for example, he points to racial discrimination in among job applicants. Now, there is an entire field of studies that are known as audit studies. And here's how this works. This is often conducted by sociologists. And what they do is they send out resumes to employers that have posted want ads. And those resumes are identical in every way except for one factor. The names of the applicant might be traditionally black-sounding first names or traditionally white-sounding first names. So there was a famous audit study that was done back in 2004. If I remember the researchers' names, it was Bertrand and Melanathan. And the title of their study was, Are Greg and Emily More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? And so they actually used those names in their audit study. And they sent out these resumes to employers. And what they found out was that there was a 30% lower callback rate among, for the applicants that had a black-sounding name, like Lakeisha or Jamal. In other words, what that meant is that for every 2 applications that a white applicant sent out, or an applicant with a white-sounding first name, an applicant with a black-sounding first name would have to send out 3 applications to get the same amount of callbacks. Okay? So that was the conclusion of that particular study. And a number of other studies have shown this as well. And Yancey's argument is that this has shown that, at least in that particular field of research, we don't see a significant change in racial discrimination. He also points to the example of disproportionately higher rates of traffic stops among African Americans compared to white Americans. And so this phenomenon is sometimes colloquially known as driving while black. And studies have been done on this, and there does seem to be a statistically significant factor that points towards racial discrimination in these phenomena. Because what happens is you do have higher rates of African Americans being pulled over than white Americans during daylight hours. But after sunset, that gap closes. Why might that be? Because you can't as easily tell the race of the driver after sunset, can you? Now, there have been several studies that have been done on this. That there does seem to be some truth to that study. There has also been a number of studies done on the healthcare system, and I think Yancey points to a meta-analysis that looked at, I think, 37 different studies on racial discrimination in the healthcare system, and 26 of those studies showed statistically significant rates of racial discrimination in the healthcare system. That is sort of my summary of his chapter. And I'll share with you some of my thoughts on this too, but I want to hear what you guys think about what I've said so far. That one was done in 2004. A little bit. There have been more recent ones. I think he points to a study that's as recent as 2017. So he's not relying exclusively on that one. In fact, he's pointing to other authors that have sort of combined these audit studies into a meta-analysis, and that one is a bit more recent, like within the past 5 years. I have a few points to make in response to Yancey's chapter. Overall, I can't deny his overall point, that we do in some ways see statistically significant racial discrimination in different areas of society today. I might have some questions about some of these specific examples that he uses. So, for example, he points to the lower mortgage approval rates. But as I said previously, a lot of that can be explained in terms of gaps in credit scores. Right? That's not based on prejudice or discrimination. That's simply the reality that different racial groups have different average credit scores. And so that does go a significant way towards explaining those mortgage approval rates. And so, related to that point, when we're looking at these sorts of disparities, I think it is important for us to distinguish between root causes and immediate causes of racial disparities. If we're asking what the root causes are, yes, a lot of this does go back to the legacy of slavery and segregation. But those practices have been over and done with for several decades now. Why do these disparities persist? Because now we're dealing with different immediate causes, right? So we're dealing with lower credit scores, for example. And here's another reality when it comes to mortgage approval rates, for example. You're more likely to have a higher credit score if you're married. Because, and there's probably several reasons why this is the case, but when you're married, you are accountable to another person for how you use your money and for paying your bills. And so on average, married people have a higher credit score than single people by over 50 points. And so that's a relevant variable. And we also see differences between racial groups when it comes to marital status, right? White people have a higher marriage rate than black people. So that goes part of the way towards explaining that gap as well. Again, it's important for us to distinguish between the root causes and the immediate causes of these racial disparities. Another point that I could highlight would be when it comes to those audit studies. There has been a little bit of debate over whether or not these audit studies are really demonstrating that degree of racial discrimination. There is another audit study that I could point to that was done back in 2014 by two researchers at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I think their names were Darolia and Codell. And what they did was an audit study, but with a twist. Rather than using traditionally black-sounding first names, they used traditionally black last names, like Washington and Jefferson. So those last names, 90% of the people who have those last names are black. So they sent out audit studies, they sent out these resumes where they were identical in every way, but the only difference was the last name. And they actually found no statistically significant difference in the callback rate between whites and blacks. Now, what might that tell us then? What's significant about different first names versus last names? Well, it's possible, and some people have hypothesized this, that what's actually going on in those audit studies is it's not race discrimination, it's class discrimination. Because a lot of those traditionally black-sounding first names like Lakeisha and Jamal tend to be more prevalent among lower-class African Americans than among upper-class African Americans. It's still discrimination, but it might actually be on account of class rather than race. Now, I should also point out that some folks have pushed back against that study by Darolia and Codell. I think just yesterday I saw a study done in the 2019 issue of the journal Association where they were claiming that that study might be flawed. So I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not the expert in analyzing those studies. I am simply just highlighting the point that it is sometimes difficult to draw clear conclusions from studies like these. Okay, another point that I want to make is, yes, we do need to acknowledge that a lot of these racial disparities, in some respects, they do trace back to institutional racism in our past. They are, in some respect, ongoing effects of institutional racism in America. But it would also be a mistake to treat these as insurmountable barriers. Yes, I understand they cause frustration and they cause hardship. However, there is something to notice about some of these examples that he uses. So to use another book that I've quoted from in this class, the African-American political scientist Wilfred Riley, who teaches at Kentucky State University, has this to say about the audit studies in particular, so those studies that allegedly demonstrate racial discrimination in hiring. The simple reality that racism still exists does not challenge the empirical mathematical point that cultural variables are a bigger predictor of group success than experiences with bigotry. Although this is almost never done in popular press coverage of these findings, it is worth taking a look at the weaknesses of the well-done but limited studies on discrimination against black job applicants. Perhaps most notably, in those experiments that were designed to measure levels of workplace discrimination, everybody of all races got a job. That's his emphasis, original. In the National Bureau of Economic Research study, looking at the impact of black names on hiring decisions, whites got 1 callback per 10 applications, while blacks received 1 callback per 14 to 15 applications. However, the researchers responded to well over 1,300 want ads using relatively small sets of white and black resumes. In other words, just using their small sets of resumes, what that meant is that the white resumes received about 130 callbacks, and the black resumes still received like about 90 to 100 callbacks, which means that the net result is that everybody would have gotten a job. And so there is a racial disparity there, and we do need to acknowledge that that partly might be attributable to racial discrimination. But there's another important factor to consider here, which is that everybody would have gotten a job. And in the Pager study, which I don't think Yancey cites, but Riley does, 350 employers were contacted, and the widely cited 14% response rate for black job applicants without a criminal record implies that the primarily black group of student volunteers received more than 40 callbacks for final interviews. So what Riley's doing here is he's simply highlighting the fact that these barriers, they do exist, and he's acknowledging that as well, but they're not insurmountable. And so we have to recognize that discrimination does not entail destiny. I think if you start thinking in that mindset, that's the problem with structural determinism, which I talked about a couple weeks ago. That's one of the key teachings within critical race theory. These barriers do not determine your destiny, right? They can be overcome. That doesn't mean the barriers are negligible. That doesn't mean it's okay that we have these barriers, but they can be overcome, and that's a message that I think needs to be heard. Another point that I would say in response to Yancey's chapter is to go back to Thomas Sowell's book on discrimination and disparities. We actually have to analyze carefully what is discrimination and how does it happen and what are the different kinds of discrimination. Now, at a broad level, Sowell acknowledges that not all discrimination is bad and everybody recognizes that. There is discrimination on an empirical individual level where you are judging each person as an individual regardless of what group that person is a part of. He calls that discrimination 1. This is empirically based. This is basically where you are judging a person by the content of their character, right? And he says that's the ideal, right? This would be the type of discrimination where you are treating a person on their own merits. And then there's discrimination 2, which is, we could call that prejudicial discrimination. This is where you treat people negatively based on arbitrary aversions or animosities to individuals of a particular race or sex, for example. So this would be just irrational bias. This would be racial hatred. And he acknowledges that's bad. And hopefully we can all acknowledge that is bad. That would be sinful discrimination. And so it's important for us to distinguish between these two. However, it gets a little bit more complicated here because those are not the only two types of discrimination. Because it turns out that when it comes to discrimination 1, which we can say is the ideal, it's very costly to be able to discriminate on the basis of a person as an individual. Because you have to know that person as an individual. You have to know their character. And you're not going to know a person's character immediately. And so he uses this example. And this is a purely hypothetical example. These are not real numbers. These are not real groups that he's talking about. But he says to take an extreme example. For the sake of illustration, if 30% of the people in group X are alcoholics and 2% of the people in group Y are alcoholics, an employer may well prefer to hire people from group Y for work where an alcoholic would be not only ineffective but dangerous. This would mean that a majority of the people in group X, 70%, would be more likely to be denied employment, even though they are not alcoholics. What matters crucially to the employer is the cost of determining which individual is or is not an alcoholic when job applicants all show up sober on the day when they are seeking employment. This is a tough one. This does not sit well with me because I recognize that 70% of the people in group X are being discriminated against for something that they haven't done. This is problematic, but it's also a reality. That's why Sowell adds a third category here. This is another form of empirical discrimination because it is based on statistical realities. But here's what he says. Discrimination 1A then would be judging an individual on their own merits. Discrimination 1B, which we could call statistical discrimination, is judging an individual by empirical evidence on the group they are a part of. Let me give you an example. Suppose you are walking down the street at night and a person is approaching you. That person could be a 70-year-old Asian person, or it could be a 20-year-old African-American male. You know nothing about this person. Are you going to react differently to those two different individuals? Maybe. Because here's the thing. It's not that you are making a judgment about that person. You don't know this person. But there is going to be a cost, potentially, depending on how you react. Because statistics, for example, let's just use gender, for example. Men are much more likely to commit violent crimes than women, right? So if I were to walk past you and you didn't know me down the street, you might be inclined to cross to the other side of the street as you're passing by me, simply because of the statistical reality that because I'm a man, I might be more likely to commit a violent crime against you. Now, odds are I'm not going to, right? The reality is the majority of people that are men do not commit violent crimes. But of those that do commit violent crimes, the large majority are men. And so this is what makes it so difficult to deal with discrimination in society, because the problem is discrimination 1B is not the same as discrimination 2, but it does create harmful effects on people that are discriminated against by that criteria. And so there's a couple points that I would say regarding what Sowell is describing as discrimination 1B. Number one, I agree it's not fair, right? The fact that some people would be discriminated against based on the statistics of the group that they belong to, that's not fair. Number two, it would also mean that if this is happening in society, it means our society has not yet arrived at the state of complete colorblindness, right? If this is happening, it means we're not fully colorblind as a society. Now, I think we should agree colorblindness should be the goal. And I definitely agree CRT is not going to get us to that goal. However, we also have to acknowledge the ways that it's not happening yet in our society. But also, we have to be careful not to conflate that category with what Sowell calls discrimination 2, which is prejudicial discrimination. Because there are costs to not doing that. So for example, think of the store owner in this example of an employer who doesn't want to hire an alcoholic. If he hires an alcoholic, it could be possible that the products that employee is producing will be defective, there could be problems in the workplace, there could be problems with customers, and that could harm the business as a whole. And if that happens frequently enough, it could cause the company to go out of business, right? You're not going to fix this problem by sending that employer to diversity training, right? That's not going to be the solution. So, what do we conclude from this? That discrimination does still happen, and sometimes people are unfairly discriminated against on the basis of the groups to which they belong, rather than on the basis of their individual character. It also means we have not yet fully arrived at the state where we're a colorblind society. We need to acknowledge those things. And therefore, when Yancey points to these examples of institutional discrimination, yeah, we can acknowledge that that does happen, and we can grieve for those who suffer the harmful effects of that. Now we have to think about what are the solutions we can work towards in light of the fact that this sort of thing happens in society. I'm going to get there in subsequent lessons, but I do want to leave us with one Bible passage that's relevant to the problem of discrimination in society. This is James chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? The Bible does condemn discrimination, right? We should be striving towards a society where people are not discriminated against on the basis of the group that they belong to. We also have to acknowledge it is a reality, and it does happen, and we have to think about what will be the most effective way of dealing with these forms of discrimination that will not have detrimental effects on society as a whole. And so that's what our challenge is as Christians in the church and as citizens of our country. That's what we need to grapple with, and that's where I think we need to start having some collaborative conversations about solutions that will actually deal with these problems effectively. That's all I have for you today, so let me ask, do you guys have any further thoughts now? Right. If I don't hire him, that's a significant yes. Greater harm. Right. There is, crossing the street is one thing, but if you're denying employment to somebody based on their race, that's going to have a much more significant harmful effect on them as a person. And if it happens enough, it's going to harm the entire group. And it could end up becoming like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where a lot of these discriminations are the result of prior discrimination. And so, yeah, that is absolutely a reality that we need to acknowledge can happen. Right. Now, I would say as a lender, you have more of a responsibility to do some digging into that person's individual qualifications, right? When you can do things like measuring their credit score and their employment background and their income level, then you can discriminate on the basis of legitimate criteria. That's discrimination 1A, right? And so I think for institutions especially, I think there's a greater responsibility towards doing that, towards bearing that greater cost of determining the individual's qualifications. All right. How about I close our time in prayer and then we get ready for corporate worship? Father God, we do thank you, Lord, that you have given us new life through your Son, Jesus Christ, and you have given us a new identity. And I do pray, Lord, that you would enable us to faithfully live out that identity. And I do pray, Lord, that you would guard us against the sin of discrimination. I do pray, God, that we would treat fellow human beings as fellow bearers of your image. And I do pray, Lord, that you would enable us as citizens of our country to wrestle honestly with these challenges that our society faces, to call out wrongful discrimination when it happens, but also to pursue justice and truth, and to not sacrifice one for the sake of the other, but recognize that ultimately both of those together are our goal, to pursue justice according to truth. So I pray, God, that you would equip us by your Holy Spirit to fulfill that task, and we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.